Animals don't belong in first class, neither do their owners. The words, sharp and humiliating, lasted through the airport's crowded terminal, loud enough for hundreds of strangers to hear. The uniformed employee barely glanced at the woman clutching the trembling pet carrier, his sneer wide and public. Around her, the sea of passengers parted not with sympathy, but with the kind of silent judgment that burns hotter than any insult. Her daughter stood stiff beside her, knuckling white, trying to make herself invisible. Meanwhile, a well-dressed man in a tailored suit breezed past, escorted to the gate with smiles and handshakes. No one stopped him, no one checked his papers, but the family left standing in shame? They were treated like criminals, threats to the fragile image of luxury the airline desperately clung to. Phones rose quietly, catching snippets of the unfolding humiliation, but nobody dared to intervene. And yet, what the staff and the passengers didn't realize was this: the very people they tried to cast aside would soon wield a power that could bring the entire institution to its knees. If this story moves you even a little, we'd love for you to like the video, subscribe to stay connected with us, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Which moment hit you the hardest? We're always listening. The sun was just beginning to climb over the skyline as the Bennett family pulled up to the curbside of Hamilton International Airport, the morning light bathing the sleek terminal in a golden glow. Olivia Bennett, clad in a crisp white blouse and dark jeans, stepped out first, adjusting the small carrier that held Max, the family's loyal golden retriever mix and trained emotional support animal. Her husband, Marcus Bennett, a towering figure with a calm demeanor, helped their teenage daughter Kayla hoist her travel backpack onto her shoulders. They looked like any other excited family ready for a long-awaited vacation, yet unseen by them, today was about to be anything but ordinary. As they made their way into the terminal, the Bennetts drew a few glances, not because of anything unusual they did, but simply because of who they were. A proud black family moving with grace and quiet excitement. Olivia smiled warmly at the check-in agent behind the kiosk, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a name tag that read, Brandon. "Good morning," Olivia said, producing their boarding passes and Max's paperwork. "We're checking in for flight 726, first class, with a pet companion registered." Brandon barely concealed his disdain, glancing down at the papers before giving a forced smile. His eyes lingered a beat too long on Max, then shifted back to the family with a thinly veiled skepticism. "Pet carrier certified?" he asked, his voice flat. Olivia nodded, already sensing the shift in energy. "Yes, sir. All documentation is here. He's been cleared under airline regulations." Brandon sighed dramatically, flipping through the documents as if searching for a mistake. After several tense seconds, he said, "I'm going to have to get a supervisor to re-verify these. Wait over there," gesturing vaguely toward a corner. The Bennetts exchanged uneasy glances, but compiled without protest. Passengers behind them in line whispered audibly. It wasn't the first time they had faced subtle prejudice, but this time the tension was thicker, the air heavier. 15 minutes ticked by. Anxiousness crept into Kayla's expression. Olivia reached down to stroke Max's fur through the carrier, murmuring reassurances to both her daughter and herself. Finally, Brandon returned, with a woman, wearing a navy blazer and a badge that read, Amelia Shift Supervisor. Amelia's smile was tight, her posture rigid. She didn't even bother looking at the family before announcing, "Due to updated regulations, emotional support animals are no longer automatically eligible to fly in the cabin. We'll need to check the dog as cargo." Marcus frowned, his voice firm but polite. "Ma'am, we're fully compliant. Max is under 10 pounds, he's properly created, and we've paid the in-cabin pet fee. Please review the documents again." Amelia's face hardened. "Sir, I'm not here to debate. You can either check the animal or forfeit boarding." The injustice clanged like a bell in the quiet of the terminal. Nearby travelers began to notice, their curious glances turning to open stares. Olivia drew a deep breath. "May I speak to a manager, please?" she asked. Amelia folded her arms. "I am the manager," she snapped. "Either comply or you will be removed from the flight roster." Olivia could feel the humiliation rising in her throat like bile. Caleb clutched Max's carrier closer, her knuckles whitening. Around them, whispers began to weave through the air, a few camera phones subtly raised. Brandon leaned in toward Amelia and muttered, not quite quietly enough, First class is getting too loose these days. Olivia heard it, Marcus heard it, and despite every instinct telling them to fight, they held their ground in silence. This was not the place to lose control. Amelia sighed heavily, as if burdened by their mere existence, then handed back their papers with a look of exaggerated patience. Fine, but we'll be keeping a close eye on your pet. Any disruption and you're out. The Bennetts nodded stiffly and proceeded to security. As they moved away from the check-in counter, Kayla whispered, "Mom? Why are they treating us like we did something wrong?" Olivia didn't answer immediately. She crouched to adjust Max's carrier again, hiding the tightness in her throat. "Because sometimes," she finally said, "people judge you before they know you. But that doesn't mean they're right." Kayla's eyes were wide, absorbing the lesson etched in real time. At the security checkpoint, the indignities continued. The TSA agent patted down Marcus more thoroughly than anyone else in line, lingering so long that other passengers began to shuffle impatiently. Olivia was pulled aside for an additional bag search, despite the scanner's no alerts. Kayla watched it all, her game nervously tapping Max's crate. By the time they reached their gate, the Bennetts were emotionally battered, but determined to stay composed. Gate 17 buzzed with activity. But Brandon's voice came over the intercom, dripping with thinly disguised contempt. "Attention passengers for Flight 7 and 26. Please note that pets improperly housed may not be permitted to board. Thank you for your cooperation." Though he hadn't named them, the implication was unmistakable. Heads turned, people stared. A few chuckled, the Bennetts stood straighter. They wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them flinch. As boarding began, the first-class line moved quickly. Elderly couples, well-dressed businessmen. Olivia, Marcus, Kayla, and Max stepped forward with their priority boarding group. Brandon stood at the gate, scanning boarding passes with mechanical precision. When he saw them approach, he smirked slightly and held out his hand. "Let me check the pet carrier one more time," he said with exaggerated patience. "It's standard procedure for special cases." Marcus said nothing but handed over the carrier for inspection. Brandon bent lower, peering into the carrier, pretending to scrutinize Max like a customs agent finding contraband. Finally, with an exaggerated shrug, he handed it back. "Good enough," he muttered. The Bennetts moved past him onto the jet bridge, the humiliation clinging to them like an invisible second skin. As they boarded the plane, a flight attendant with a bright smile greeted them warmly. Olivia found herself almost unable to smile back. As they settled into their luxurious first-class seats, Kayla leaned over and whispered, "Mom, are we still going to have a good trip?" Olivia squeezed her hand. "We're going to have the best trip," she said, but inside she felt the quiet rage simmering. They had been judged, belittled, dismissed. But they weren't powerless, not even close. And before this day was over, the people who thought they could diminish them would learn exactly who the Bennetts were. The Bennetts had barely settled into their plush first-class seats when the shadow of trouble returned. Brandon appeared again at the front of the cabin, clipboard in hand, his smile a thin, dangerous line that didn't reach his cold eyes. As Olivia tucked Max's carrier carefully under the seat in front of her, following every regulation to the letter, Brandon approached, his steps loud on the carpeted floor, drawing the attention of several curious passengers. "Excuse me," Brandon said with an exaggerated politeness that dripped with disdain. "I'm going to need to verify your pet's paperwork again." Marcus leaned forward, confusion flickering in his eyes. "We've already cleared it at the counter, and at the gate," he said evenly, the exhaustion evident but his tone controlled. Brandon's smirk widened as he extended his hand. "Just routine, sir. Regulations, you understand." With a tight breath, Olivia produced the paperwork once more, neatly organized in a plastic sleeve. Health certificate, vaccination record, airline approval letter, all perfectly in order. Brandon flipped through them slowly, painfully slowly, like a teacher searching for a student's mistake. After an excruciating pause, he snapped the folder shut and said loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear, "Paperwork like this? Anyone could fake it these days. It doesn't prove anything." A collective shift rippled through the cabin. Heads turned, whispered through the air. Olivia froze, the humiliation hitting like a slap. Marcus's jaw tightened visibly, but he kept his voice level. "Are you accusing us of falsifying documents?" he asked, every word precise and clipped. Brandon shrugged, the gesture careless, dismissive. "I'm just saying," he said, "we have to be extra careful, especially with people trying to sneak animals into first class where they don't belong." The emphasis on people wasn't subtle, and the implication hung there, heavy and poisonous. Kayla shrank back into her seat, her hands gripping the armrests, her wide eyes darting from her parents to Brandon. Olivia's fingers twitched with the need to respond, to stand, to shout, but years of experience told her restraint was their sharpest weapon. Instead, she said quietly, "We followed every rule. Please step aside so we can prepare for takeoff." Brandon's smile vanished, replaced by a glint of something ugly. "Actually," he said, voice sharp, "the captain has just informed me that there's been a seating adjustment." He flipped through a few pages on his clipboard, the action clearly for show. "Due to operational needs, we'll need to reseat you." Marcus's eyes narrowed. What kind of operational needs? Brandon clicked his tongue, feigning regret. Regulations require that passengers with non-essential animals be relocated to economy. The word non-essential stung more than any insult could. Around them, some passengers pretended not to listen, while others stared openly, some with pity, some with barely concealed smugness. Olivia inhaled sharply. "We purchased first-class tickets weeks ago," she said, voice firm but calm. "We paid for Max's in-cabin pass. We followed your airline's exact procedures." Brandon held up a hand to cut her off. "Ma'am, it's not up for debate. Please gather your belongings. You and your husband will be reseated in economy. The animal," he glanced disdainfully at Max, "will be transported in the cargo hold." Kayla gasped audibly. "No," she said, the first word she had spoken since boarding. "He can't go down there. He'll be scared." Marcus put a steadying hand on his daughter's shoulder. Olivia leaned closer to Brandon, lowering her voice to a deadly whisper. "You're aware that placing a trained support dog in cargo without cause is against federal ADA guidelines, aren't you?" Brandon's expression flickered, just slightly, one heartbeat of hesitation before hardening again. "Rules change all the time," he said curtly. "Right now, you have two choices: move peacefully or a calculated humiliation." The nearby passengers buzzed with whispers like a hive disturbed. Olivia saw a few phones lift suddenly, cameras recording, documenting every painful second. Marcus met Olivia's gaze. A silent conversation passed between them, one that spanned 1,000 shared battles against prejudice, indignity, and quiet rage. Without a word, they began gathering their belongings. Kayla's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Max whimpered softly inside his carrier, sensing the tension radiating from his humans. Brandon stepped back, arms folded smugly, savoring his victory. "Flight attendants will assist you in the back," he said, his voice syrupy with false kindness. As they stood, Marcus cradled Max's carrier close to his chest, shielding the trembling dog from the stares and whispers. The walk down the narrow aisle felt like a parade of shame. Passengers either avoided their gaze or watched hungrily, some murmuring under their breath. A woman in a pearl necklace clucked her tongue disapprovingly. A man in a business suit smirked and whispered something to his seatmate, eliciting a chuckle. Every step toward the economy section weighed heavier than the last. When they reached the back of the plane, a young flight attendant named Clara met them with an apologetic look in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the front of the plane. "This wasn't my decision." Olivia offered a tight, exhausted smile. "We know," she said quietly. Clara showed them to their new seats, cramped and sandwiched between rows packed with restless travelers. There was barely enough space to fit Max's carrier under the seat, and certainly no way to move without jostling someone. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the narrow seat, trying not to let his frustration show. Olivia stroked Max's head through the mesh, whispering soothing words even as her own heart pounded with helpless anger. Kayla curled into her seat, pressing her forehead against the window to hide the tears threatening to spill. Outside, the tarmac buzzed with activity, oblivious to the private humiliation unfolding within the aircraft. Brandon's voice came over the intercom again, announcing pre-flight procedures, every word a reminder of who held the power. At this moment, as the plane prepared for takeoff, the Bennett sat silently, a fortress of dignity in a sea of casual cruelty. Max let out a soft, almost inaudible whine, and Olivia shushed him gently, her hand trembling slightly against the carrier. Above them, the overhead lights dimmed for departure. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft lurched forward, Olivia closed her eyes and breathed deeply. feeling the injustice settle into her bones. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about everything they had fought against all their lives. And deep down she knew, this was only the beginning. The aircraft rumbled steadily as it taxied down the runway, but for the Bennetts, the true turbulence was internal. Seated uncomfortably in the cramped economy row, their first-class tickets rendered meaningless, they said little, preserving their strength for the ordeal ahead. As the wheels lifted off the tarmac and the plane ascended into the heavy gray sky, Olivia stared out the window. The landscape shrinking beneath them, her heart swelling with indignation. She knew this wasn't over. Far from it. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Clara, the young flight attendant who had shown them some semblance of humanity, returned to their row with a forced smile and a tray of drinks. "Would you like anything?" she offered quietly, almost apologetically. Kayla just stared blankly ahead. Max whimpered softly in his carrier, unsettled by the vibrations and the tension surrounding his family. Time dragged. The intercom crackled, announcing that the flight would soon be preparing for descent into Chicago O'Hare for their connecting flight to New York. Olivia checked her watch. Their layover would be tight, but manageable assuming no one else decided to invent another reason to sabotage them. When the plane landed and taxied to the gate, passengers jostled to grab their belongings, eager to disembark. The Bennetts waited patiently, as they always had, following the unspoken rules of courtesy they knew would never protect them from judgment, but kept them from giving anyone more ammunition. As they finally made their way off the plane and into the bustling terminal, the familiar chaos of a major airport enveloped them. The sharp scent of coffee from a nearby kiosk, the garbled announcements over loudspeakers, the endless river of people rushing past. They had barely stepped into the main concourse when Brandon reappeared, Kiploid still clutched in his hand like a weapon. He was flanked now by another airline employee, Amelia, the woman from the check-in counter, her expression pinched with self-importance. "Excuse me," Brandon called out, his voice slicing through the noise, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. Olivia stiffened, turning slowly to face him. Marcus squared his shoulders instinctively. Kayla moved closer to her mother, clutching the carrier containing Max tighter against her chest. "We have an additional security verification required before you board your next flight," Brandon announced loudly, ignoring the confusion looks from bystanders. "Standard procedure." With no one intervened, they never did. As Brandon gestured for them to step aside, a murmur rose among the waiting crowd. Olivia glanced around, feeling the weight of 100 curious eyes boring into them. As if on cue, a tall white man in a sharp designer suit and gleaming Italian shoes strode confidently toward the boarding line. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and he carried an expensive leather duffel bag casually over one shoulder. Without waiting for permission, he cut directly in front of the Bennetts. Brandon's face lit up with a, "Sir," sighed. "Mr. Cartwright," he said warmly, extending a hand. "Right this way, sir. Priority boarding for our premium guests." Cartwright barely nodded in acknowledgement, breezing past the Bennetts as if they were invisible, his cologne lingering behind him like a sneer. Olivia opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, Amelia leaned in close to Brandon, her voice low but unmistakably sharp. "Who do they think they are?" she hissed, unaware or perhaps uncaring that Olivia stood just feet away. "People like that just drag the whole brand down." Brandon chuckled under his breath, a sound that made Olivia's skin crawl. "Exactly," he muttered, flipping through the papers on his clipboard with a feigned air of authority. "Letting them parade around in first class makes us look desperate." Kayla heard it too. She looked up at her mother with wide, confused eyes. "Why do they hate us?" Marcus placed a calming hand on Olivia's back, grounding her, reminding her silently of the state. "Not here. Not yet." Olivia nodded almost imperceptibly, swallowing the fury that burned in her throat like acid. Nearby, passengers whispered among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed entertained. A few openly filmed the interaction with their phones, no doubt ready to post a viral clip labeled "Airport Drama." Brandon turned back to the Bennetts with a mock polite smile plastered across his face. "If you'll just step over here," he said, gesturing toward a small roped-off area near the gate, clearly intended to isolate them from the rest of the boarding passengers. Olivia tightened her grip on Max's carrier. Kayla clutched her mother's arm, her body trembling slightly. Marcus's mouth set into a grim line. They moved as directed, acutely aware of the spectacle being made of them. Cartwright, meanwhile, was ushered onto the jet bridge with fawning attention, her gate agents practically tripping over themselves to ensure his comfort. As they waited, isolated and humiliated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Honestly, if it weren't for the optics, we wouldn't even have to pretend with them," she said. Brandon laughed quietly, a humorless sound. "Don't worry," he said. "Pretty soon they'll be right where they belong." Olivia caught every word. She burned them into her memory, filing them away for the moment she knew was coming, the moment when the truth would rip through this charade like a bolt of lightning. Max whimpered again, sensing the rising tension. Caleb bent down to stroke his head through the mesh of the carrier, whispering soft reassurances that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Across the concourse, more passengers boarded their flight without incident, their lives untouched by the small cruelty playing out at Gate 42. Olivia felt a sharp, almost electric sense of anticipation building inside her. This wasn't just about a seating arrangement anymore. This was about dignity, about justice, about showing the world when the time was right exactly who the Bennetts were and what they stood for. She exchanged a look with Marcus, a silent pact forming between them. Not yet. But soon. Very soon. The minutes dragged like hours as the Bennetts remained corralled near the gate, the silent glares and the buzzing whispers slicing into them sharper than any knife. Olivia kept her chin lifted, refusing to bow under the weight of humiliation, even as Max whimpered softly in his carrier, and Kayla's grip on her mother's hand tightened desperately. Brandon loitered near the boarding desk, whispering with Amelia and occasionally glancing toward them with a smug expression that made Olivia's skin crawl. The overhead intercom crackled to life suddenly, and every traveler in the terminal instinctively turned their head toward the source. Brandon's voice, falsely cheerful yet laced with a cruel undertone, filled the air. "Attention passengers at Gate 42, he announced, his words slicing clean through the murmuring crowd. "Due to enhanced safety protocols, certain individuals who have not met our security standards will experience additional screening before boarding. We appreciate your patience and understanding." Though he never said their names, every eye in the vicinity immediately turned toward the Bennetts, their faces registering a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and thinly veiled disgust. A gasp rippled through the waiting area, and several travelers shook their heads as if the Bennetts had committed some heinous, unseen crime. Olivia felt the air rush from her lungs as if she had been struck. Her heart hammered furiously in her chest. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles whitening as he fought to maintain composure. Kayla's cheeks burned with shame as she ducked her head, pressing herself tighter against her mother's side. Max, sensing the heightening anxiety, began to whine louder, scratching softly at the inside of his carrier. Before Olivia or Marcus could react, two uniformed airport security officers appeared, weaving through the crowd with grim expressions. They approached with purpose, one of them, a burly man with a name tag reading Officer Reed, stepping directly into Marcus's path. "Sir, we need you to come with us," Reed said firmly, his tone broking no argument. Olivia instinctively stepped forward, her mouth opening to protest, but the second officer, a stern woman with her hand resting ominously near her radio, blocked her path. Marcus's jaw tightened visibly, his eyes flashing with barely contained rage, but he nodded once, stiffly, and handed Max's carrier to Olivia. "I'll be right back," he said slowly, voice strained. Officer Reed grabbed Marcus's elbow, not roughly but with unmistakable authority, and steered him toward a side hallway leading to a private screening area. As they disappeared from view, Olivia felt her knees weaken slightly, but she forced herself to stay upright, to stay calm. For Kayla, behind them, the whispers grew louder. Someone nearby muttered, "Figures," while another snapped a picture with their phone. Amelia sidled up beside Brandon at the boarding desk, leaning in close enough for Olivia to hear the sickening words that dripped from her mouth like poison. "One less problem to worry about," Amelia sneered, her voice deaf Amelia to singing. Brandon chuckled, pretending to adjust some paperwork, his satisfaction practically radiating off him. As Olivia tried to steady her breathing, another airline worker approached, this one a tall, lanky man in a reflective vest. He avoided looking Olivia directly in the eye as he spoke. "We're going to need to check the animal," he said gruffly, extending a hand toward the carrier. Olivia stiffened. "He's already been cleared," she said, the words thick on her tongue, the injustice nearly choking her. "You have all the paperwork." The worker shook his head, eyes flicking nervously toward Brandon as if seeking approval. "Just following orders, ma'am. Standard procedure." Without waiting for her consent, he reached down and lifted Max's carrier roughly, eliciting a frightened yelp from the dog. "Hey!" Kayla cried out, tears springing to her eyes. Olivia put a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders, biting down hard on the urge to scream. She followed as the worker marched toward a service elevator near the gate. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing a dim, grimy interior that reeked faintly of oil and disinfectant. Olivia hesitated at the threshold, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong, but the worker merely nodded impatiently toward the elevator. "Cargo intake's downstairs," he said, as if explaining something obvious to a slow child. "Animals that don't pass immediate cabin inspection have to go below." He stepped inside, still holding Max's carrier, and the doors snapped shut between them before Olivia could protest. She stared at the closed elevator in stunned silence, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her ears. Max was gone, shoved into the underbelly of the airport like an unwanted suitcase. Beside her, Kayla began to cry openly now, fat tears rolling down her cheeks unchecked. Olivia knelt in front of her, brushing the hair back from her daughter's forehead, whispering soothing words that felt like lies. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. "We'll fix this." Brandon's voice came over the loudspeaker again, dripping smugness. "Final boarding call for Flight 204 to New York. All remaining passengers please proceed to the gate immediately." Olivia rose to her full height, every inch of her trembling with fury and helplessness. Her husband was being detained, her child was terrified, her dog had been stolen from her, shoved God knew where. And still, the world moved on around them, indifferent, complicit. Somewhere in the crowd, a man with a laptop open began typing furiously, documenting everything. A woman across the aisle shook her head and muttered, "Unbelievable." Though whether in sympathy or scorn, Olivia could not tell. She squared her shoulders, took Kayla's hand in hers, and forced herself to move forward, step by agonizing step, toward the boarding gate. Marcus had not returned. Max was somewhere, below their feet, scared and alone. And Olivia knew with a terrible certainty that the worst was still yet to come. Olivia gripped Kayla's hand tightly as they approached the gate, the final few passengers filing through the jet bridge ahead of them. Her mind raced, trying to calculate the risks, the options, the right move. She couldn't leave Marcus behind. She couldn't leave Max trapped and terrified in the cold belly of the plane. But her daughter needed to feel safe, needed to believe that her parents could still protect her even in the face of injustice so raw it stole the breath from Olivia's lung. As they neared the boarding scanner, a woman standing a few rows back pulled out her phone, angling it discreetly toward the scene. Olivia caught the slight movement out of the corner of her eye. It was a small act of defiance, a quiet attempt to bear witness to what was happening. The woman, a petite blonde in a gray sweater, tapped record, capturing the tense tableau, a mother and daughter, alone, surrounded by cold indifference and smirking authority figures. Brandon noticed almost instantly. His face darkened, and he barked something under his breath to one of the security officers lingering nearby. The officer, a stocky man with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl, moved quickly toward the woman. "Ma'am," he said sharply, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "Filling inside the secure area is prohibited. Delete that footage immediately." The woman hesitated, her thumb hovering over her phone screen. "I'm just recording public behavior," she said, her voice steady but nervous. The officer stepped closer, towering over her. "Delete it, now, or I'll confiscate the device." Olivia watched helplessly as the woman's resolve faltered. Trembling slightly, she tapped the screen, erasing the video under the watchful eyes of the guard. Around them, a few onlookers turned away, feigning ignorance, unwilling to invite the same wrath upon them. Brandon's smile returned, tight and triumphant. The evidence was gone. The story would remain whatever he said it was. He turned his attention back to Olivia and Kayla, his expression twisting into something far uglier than mere disdain. He spoke into a small handheld radio clipped to his belt, his words crisp and deliberate. "Passenger incident at Gate 42. Non-compliant individuals refusing boarding instructions, requesting immediate authorization to deny boarding privileges." Olivia's heart plummeted. She stepped forward, her voice low and urgent. "We haven't refused anything," she said fiercely. "We have complied at every step. This is harassment." Brandon didn't even look at her as he responded. "Understood," he said into the radio, then clicked it off with a sharp finality. He turned to face them fully. "Studi or disruptor behavior and failure to comply with security protocols," he announced loudly, making sure every ear nearby caught his words. "You are hereby denied boarding on Flight 203. You will need to return to the ticketing counter to rebook, pending further security review." Gasps erupted around them. A few people murmured in confusion. Some stared openly. Others pretended to fiddle with their phones to avoid involvement. Kayla clutched her mother's arm, her eyes huge and frightened. Olivia could barely hear over the roaring in her ears. "You're lying," she said quietly, but the words carried a razor's edge. "We've done nothing wrong." Brandon shrugged, his face the picture of faux professionalism. "My decision is final," he said, his voice carrying no trace of doubt, no room for appeal. "Please leave the boarding area immediately, or we will have to involve law enforcement." The nearby gate agents looked away, studiously avoiding eye contact. Amelia smirked from her post near the counter, arms folded, savoring every second of the humiliation unfolding before him. Olivia's nails dug into her palms as she struggled to keep from shaking. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to shout the truth to anyone who would listen. But she knew better. She had spent a lifetime navigating systems designed to crush dignity in the name of order. Losing control here would only feed their narrative. She knelt down to meet Kayla's gaze, smoothing her daughter's hair back from her tear-streaked face. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Slowly, with every muscle in her body rebelling, she stood, took Kayla's hand and turned away from the gate. As they moved back into the terminal, the weight of 100 unseen eyes followed them. No one spoke up. No one intervened. Brandon watched them go with a look of smug satisfaction, his arms crossed over his chest like a king surveying conquered subjects. Olivia didn't look back. She couldn't. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on staying upright, on getting Kayla somewhere safe. Somewhere she could think, somewhere she could plan. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As they disappeared into the throng of travelers moving through the terminal, another announcement echoed over the loudspeakers, cheerful and oblivious to the private battle raging just below the surface. Flight 204 to New York is now fully boarded. Doors are closing. Thank you for choosing Skylux Airlines, Bank. Olivia almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Her family had been dragged through humiliation, accused falsely, separated like criminals, and yet the system carried on, smooth and unbroken, erasing their pain with the sterile efficiency of a well-oiled machine. She tightened her grip on Kayla's hand, silently promising that the world would know the truth, that those who had orchestrated this cruel theater would not be allowed to sweep it under the rug. But first, she needed to find Marcus. She needed to find Max. She needed to bring her family back together no matter what it took. Olivia and Kayla moved through the crowded terminal like ghosts, their steps heavy, their hearts heavier. Every announcement blaring over the speakers, every laughing group of travelers clutching overpriced coffee cups felt like a slap, a reminder that their suffering was invisible to the world around them. Olivia checked her phone with shaking fingers, desperately hoping for a message from Marcus, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. Somewhere, behind them, the gate doors sealed shut, trapping their original life plan behind a wall of cruelty and indifference. She tightened her grip on Kayla's hand as they followed the overhead signs toward baggage claim, the place where lost things were collected. The elevator dinged dully when it arrived, and the two of them stepped inside the small metal box, descending deeper into the belly of the airport, where forgotten cargo and battered dreams were unceremoniously dumped. When they reached the baggage area, Olivia scanned the oversized item section where special deliveries were usually placed. A few lonely strollers, battered musical instrument cases and bulky plastic crates stood scattered along the floor, but her eyes locked instantly on the small carrier shoved carelessly against a stained wall, half hidden behind a luggage cart. "Max," she whispered brokenly, rushing forward. Kayla stumbled after her, tears welling anew as she saw the tiny form huddled inside. Max was trembling violently, his ears flattened against his skull, his tail curled tightly against his body in terror. His eyes, normally bright and curious, were dull, with confusion and fear. Olivia dropped to her knees, wrenching open the crate door with frantic hands. Max bolted into her arms, pressing himself against her chest as if trying to disappear inside her. Olivia rocked him gently, whispering soothing nonsense, feeling the rapid hammering of his heart against her own. His fur was damp in places, and there was a faint smell of mildew clinging to him, evidence of the inhumane conditions he had endured below. Then she said, "You're safe, baby. We've got you now," she murmured, her voice cracking. "You're safe."
Yeah.
Kayla crouched beside her, stroking Max's matted fur with trembling hands, whispering apologies the dog couldn't understand but desperately needed to say. They sat like that for several minutes, oblivious to the bustle around them, until a rough voice broke the fragile cocoon. "You need to clear the area, ma'am," a baggage handler barked, not unkindly but without a shred of sympathy either. "This ain't a waiting lounge." Olivia looked up slowly, her expression carved from stone. She rose to her feet, cradling Max protectively against her chest. Kayla followed, still clutching a handful of Max's fur like a lifeline. No apology was offered, no supervisor approached with red-faced contrition. No one even acknowledged that anything wrong had happened to them. The Bennetts were simply another inconvenience to be moved along, another bit of human clutter cluttering up the polished facade of the airport. Olivia straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin as she carried Max toward the exit. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, sterile and unfeeling, casting long shadows on the grimy tile floor. As they passed through the sliding doors into the biting wind outside, Olivia spotted Brandon, Amelia, and two of the security guards who had helped enforce their humiliation. They stood near the curb, laughing and jostling each other like overgrown children. Brandon pulled out his phone, angling it to capture the group. "Get in close," he barked, grinning broadly. Amelia leaned into the shot, flashing a peace sign. One of the guards threw an arm around Brandon's shoulder. The other held up his badge proudly, as if displaying a trophy. The camera clicked. A perfect snapshot of arrogance, a testament to their victory. Olivia froze, Kayla bumping into her side. Her mouth went dry as she watched Brandon tap rapidly at his phone, undoubtedly uploading the image to some private group chat or social media account reserved for the smug and the self-satisfied. Amelia laughed loudly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Keeping the skies safe," she said mockingly, and the group roared with laughter. Olivia's stomach twisted painfully, rage and sorrow warring inside her chest. She had never hated anything as much as she hated that image, that casual self-congratulation built on the backs of her family's pain. Max whimpered again, and Caleb tightened her grip on Olivia's coat sleeve. Olivia didn't move. She couldn't, not yet. She memorized the scene with agonizing clarity, the smug smiles, the gleaming badges, the casual cruelty masquerading as professionalism. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted, hardened, tempered. They would not smile and laugh and pat each other on the back while her family was left to pick up the shattered pieces of their dignity. As a cold gust of wind whipped around them, Olivia pulled Kayla closer and turned away from the grotesque celebration behind them. She had a family reunion. She had a plan to set into motion. And very soon, Brandon and everyone who had cheered his actions would understand exactly what it meant to underestimate the Bennetts. The biting wind of the city bit through Olivia's coat as she stood outside the Hyatt Grand Conference Center, a sleek glass structure glittering under the afternoon sun. She held Kayla close, Max still tucked securely under her arm, and scanned the growing crowd gathering near the entrance. The media vans were already parked in a row along the curb, satellite dishes extended like mechanical arms reaching for the sky. Reporters hurried back and forth, clutching notepads and microphones, their faces animated with anticipation. Beside her, Marcus adjusted his tie, his expression calm but resolute. He had found them barely an hour ago, after finally being released from the private screening room with no apology, no explanation, just a warning to watch his attitude in the future. Now, standing together, the Bennetts were whole again, and they were ready. Olivia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked the screen and saw the message they had been waiting for. Press ready. Conference starting at 10. She slipped the phone back into her coat and nodded once at Marcus. It was time. They moved forward through the revolving doors, stepping into the gleaming marble lobby bustling with camera crews and journalists whispering excitedly amongst themselves. Most of them had no idea who the Bennetts were yet. But they would soon. A tall man in a navy suit approached, his laminated badge identifying him as the event coordinator. He greeted them with a wide, respectful smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, we're honored to have you," he said, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "Everything's prepared as you requested." Olivia returned his smile coolly. "Thank you," she said simply. The coordinator led them through the lobby and into a cavernous ballroom, where rows of chairs faced a long stage adorned with a sleek backdrop, National Animal Rescue Initiative, Annual Expansion Announcement. The words were printed in bold letters over a beautiful image of rescued animals frolicking in open fields. At the front of the stage, a cluster of microphones stood ready. The room buzzed with energy as journalists jostled for position, their cameras trained on the empty podium. Olivia adjusted Max's carrier, feeling the comforting weight of him against her side, a living reminder of what this moment was about. A few minutes later, the coordinator tapped the microphone, and the room hushed instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us," he announced. "We are honored to welcome today's keynote speakers, Marcus and Olivia Bennett, founders and executive directors of the National Animal Rescue Initiative." A ripple of surprise ran through the audience. Heads turned, whispers ignited. The Bennett founders? Executive directors? Olivia stepped onto the stage first, followed closely by Marcus and Kayla, who clutched a small stuffed animal tightly in one hand. Max poked his nose out of the carrier, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Flashbulbs exploded as cameras snapped rapid fire. Olivia approached the podium, her heart steady, her voice clear and unwavering as she began to speak. "Good afternoon," she said, her gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to look away. "My name is Olivia Bennett, and this is my husband Marcus and our daughter Kayla. Together we lead the National Animal Rescue Initiative, a non-profit organization dedicated to saving and rehabilitating abandoned and accused animals across the country." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Today, we are proud to announce our partnership with Skylux Airports, including this city's own Hamilton International Airport, to build the nation's largest animal rescue and rehabilitation center directly on airport property, setting a new standard for humane care and transportation practices." Murmurs erupted across the room, journalists scribbling furiously in their notebooks. A few glanced at their phones, undoubtedly searching for background information, confirmation of what they were hearing. Olivia continued, her voice sharpening. "Unfortunately, just hours ago, our family was subjected to a series of humiliating, discriminatory acts at Hamilton International Airport acts that revealed a deep and disturbing bias within the very institution we have chosen to support." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Olivia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen to bring up the folder of evidence they had meticulously compiled. Emails confirming their partnerships, signed agreements, press releases, photos of the check presentations. She projected the documents onto the massive screen behind her. "This is not just about one bad experience," she said. "This is about a culture that allows prejudice to fester unchecked, even when it endangers partnerships, reputations, and, most importantly, human dignity." Marcus stepped forward then, adding his voice to hers. "Skylux Airports agreed to work with us because they claim to value compassion, integrity, and community," he said, his tone measured but seething with contained fury. "Today, we challenge them and everyone listening to prove it." At that moment, several reporters' phones buzzed simultaneously. News alerts flashed across screens. Someone had leaked the security footage. Someone had shared Brandon's cruel announcements over the intercom. The footage of Olivia and Kayla being humiliated at the gate. The video of Max being ripped away. Social media platforms exploded in real time. Hashtags like "Justice for the Bennetts" and "Skylux Screams" trended within minutes. Journalists began shouting questions over each other, their faces alight with excitement and outrage. "Are you calling for a boycott of Skylux? Will you be terminating the partnership? Are you pursuing legal action?" Olivia held up a hand for silence, waiting until the room quieted again. "We believe in accountability," she said, her voice calm but ringing with authority. "And we believe in change. We will be reevaluating all partnerships effective immediately until Skylux takes tangible steps to address and eradicate the culture of bias within its organization." Cameras flashed again, a blinding storm of light. Olivia saw Amelia's face in her mind, twisted with cruelty. She saw Brandon's smug smirk. She saw the security officers sneering as they dragged Marcus away. And she smiled inwardly, knowing they were watching this unfold, knowing they were realizing, too late, exactly who they had tried to destroy. The aftermath of the press conference spread like wildfire. By the time Olivia, Marcus, and Kayla stepped off the stage, their phones were vibrating non-stop with calls, messages, and notifications. News anchors were already dissecting the scandal live on television, headlines screaming across every major platform. Prominent donors exposed Skylux Airport racism scandal, and family behind National Animal Rescue Initiative publicly humiliated airport in crisis. Outside the conference center, reporters camped like vultures, eager to snatch any additional statement, but the Bennetts remained composed, declining further comment as they slipped into a waiting black SUV that pulled away smoothly from the curb. Inside the car, Olivia exhaled slowly, her mind already racing several steps ahead. She wasn't interested in hollow apologies or hastily arranged photo ops designed to whitewash the ugliness they had endured. This was about dismantling the rot from within, and she would accept nothing less. Barely an hour later, as the SUV glided through the city toward their temporary residence, Olivia's phone rang again. It was her assistant from the initiative's headquarters. "Liv," she said breathlessly, "you're not going to believe this. Hamilton Airport's executive director just reached out. He's requesting an emergency meeting. Said he'll come to you with overseeing." Olivia exchanged a glance with Marcus, who gave a slight nod. "Tell him we'll meet at the Langston boardroom in our hotel," Olivia said crisply. "In 1 hour. No more, no less." "Got it," her assistant confirmed before hanging up. 1 hour later, they sat at the head of a polished mahogany table inside the private boardroom of the Langston Suites, Caleb quietly sketching in a notebook beside them, while Max dozed at her feet. When the door opened, a tall, thin man in a dark gray suit stepped inside, his expression composed but his eyes betraying the panic he tried to suppress. Charles Whitmore, executive director of Hamilton International Airport, a man whose name until this moment had been associated only with expansion projects and record profits, now approached the Bennetts like a supplicant. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," he began, his voice smooth but tinged with desperation. "On behalf of the entire Hamilton International leadership team, I offer our deepest and sincerest apologies for the distress you experienced today. What happened was unexpected, and it does not reflect the values we strive to uphold." Olivia said nothing, merely studying him with. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his silence more damning than any words. Whitmore pressed on. "We would like to offer you a full public apology," he said hurriedly, "as well as complimentary lifetime first-class memberships, a substantial donation to the National Animal Rescue Initiative in your honor, and a direct line to my office should you encounter any issues in the future." He smiled thinly, clearly expecting this generous offer to end the crisis. "Mr. Whitmore," she said slowly, her voice calm but ice-aged, "this isn't about free flights or public relations band-aids. This is about systemic racism baked into the very operations of your institution." Whitmore's smile faltered slightly. Olivia leaned forward, each word cutting clean and deliberate. "We are demanding a full, independent investigation into racial discrimination practices at Hamilton International Airport, including but not limited to hiring practices, passenger treatment, and internal culture." Whitmore opened his mouth to protest, but Olivia held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "We also demand that all employees involved in today's incident, including Brandon, Amelia, and the officers who detained my husband without cause, be immediately suspended pending the results of that investigation." Marcus's voice joined hers, low and commanding. "Furthermore," he added, "we expect full cooperation with federal civil rights agencies, transparency of the investigation findings, and implementation of mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training across all departments." Whitmore's face paled visibly. He swallowed hard, but managed a weak nod. "Of course," he said hoarsely. We'll begin immediately." Olivia smiled then, not kindly. "Good," she said, "because until then, all funding from the National Animal Rescue Initiative, including the $12 million, 0 cents earmarked for the Hamilton Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, is officially frozen." Whitmore's eyes widened in horror. But, the contracts," he stammered. Marcus cut him off smoothly. "Contracts have ethics clauses," he said simply, "and your airport's behavior today violates every single one of them." At that moment, Olivia's phone buzzed again. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, and smiled faintly. She turned the device so Whitmore could see the announcement flashing across the initiative's official social media account. Effective immediately, the National Animal Rescue Initiative is suspending all financial partnerships with suspiciously indifferent to youth outing. Full investigation into discriminatory practices. We stand for dignity. We stand for justice. Whitmore's face crumpled slightly, as if he had aged 10 years in as many seconds. The room was dead silent except for the faint scratching of Kayla's pencil on her notebook. After a long moment, Whitmore straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and said, "We will cooperate fully. You have my word." Olivia nodded once, satisfied for now. But inside she knew this was only the beginning. The real fight for permanent, lasting change was just getting started. The fallout hit faster and harder than anyone at Hamilton International Airport could have imagined. Within 48 hours of the Bennett's press conference, the airport's public relations team was in full crisis mode, but no amount of carefully crafted statements could slow the tidal wave of outrage sweeping across the country. News outlets aired endless footage of the Bennett's ordeal, civil rights organizations issued scathing condemnations, and political figures weighed in demanding swift and public accountability. The airport's board of directors convened an emergency session, and by the end of it, a decision had been made that would send shockwaves through the industry. They scheduled a mandatory press conference, and it was to be broadcast live across all major networks. On the appointed day, the airport's main conference hall was packed to capacity, cameras trained unblinking on the hastily erected stage. A low murmur of anticipation buzzed through the crowd as journalists jockeyed for the best angles, their pens poised to capture every damning detail. Olivia, Marcus, and Kayla sat unobtrusively in the back of the room, their presence unnoticed by most, but unmistakably felt by those who knew exactly why this gathering was taking place. At precisely noon, Charles Whitmore strode onto the stage, flanked by members of the airport's legal counsel and human resources leadership. His face was grim, the weight of impending disaster etched deeply into every line. He stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and began. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice hollow. "In light of recent events and following an extensive preliminary review of conduct violations, Hamilton International Airport has reached a series of critical decisions to address the unacceptable behaviors exhibited by certain members of our staff." He paused, glancing down at his prepared statement, though the words themselves seemed to choke him. "Effective immediately, Brandon Kessler, Amelia Vaughn, and the security personnel involved in the incident on March 7th have been terminated for gross misconduct, violation of civil rights policies, and actions unbecoming of Evelyn and..." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a barrage of camera flashes as reporters scrambled to capture the announcement. Somewhere in the back, Olivia felt a tight knot of satisfaction loosen in her chest, though her face remained impassive. Justice, even partial justice, demanded dignity. On stage, Whitmore continued, each word heavier than the last. "Furthermore," he said, "Anderson International Airport has voluntarily opened itself to a full independent federal investigation in collaboration with the Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice into systemic bias, racial discrimination, and civil rights violations occurring within our facilities and operations." The murmuring among the reporters rose to a dull roar as they exchanged astonished glances. This was unprecedented. Airports, massive bureaucratic institutions insulated by layers of red tape and corporate protections, almost never admitted fault, let alone invited federal scrutiny onto their own grounds. But Hamilton had no choice. The Bennett story had touched a nerve that could not be. Across social media, millions rallied behind him, sharing their own experiences of quiet, casual cruelty endured in supposedly neutral spaces. Brandon, Amelia, and the others had become unwilling symbols, faces of a deeper sickness the public was no longer willing to tolerate. Whitmore's speech stumbled to its miserable conclusion, outlining vague promises of training programs, oversight committees, and accountability reviews. But no amount of bureaucratic jargon could soften the stark reality. Heads had rolled, and more would likely follow. After the official statements, a few brave reporters shouted pointed questions over the din. Will criminal charges be pursued? How will you ensure this never happens again? Are senior leadership positions being reviewed for complicity? Whitmore dodged, deflected, and finally retreated from the stage under the onslaught, leaving the room to devolve into a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted analysis. In a small adjacent conference room, Brandon sat slumped in a chair, his face ashen, the termination papers clutched loosely in one hand. Amelia stood nearby, arms crossed, her face an unreadable mask of anger and humiliation. One of the security guards who had manhandled Marcus leaned against the wall, head bowed, his badge already stripped from his uniform. They had been paraded out in front of their peers earlier that morning, escorted by HR representatives and security, their access badges deactivated, their emails frozen, their reputations shredded before they had even walked out the door. There would be no recommendations, no glowing references to help them rebuild. Their careers in aviation were effectively over. The shock still hadn't fully set in. Brandon stared at the floor, mind racing through 100 useless justifications, none of which mattered now. He had smirked, he had mocked, he had flaunted his petty power like a weapon. And now, stripped bare, he was nothing more than another casualty of his own arrogance. In the days that followed, the Department of Justice issued a formal statement confirming the launch of a federal investigation into Hamilton International Airport's practices. Subpoenas were served, employees were interviewed under oath, documents were seized. Whistleblowers emerged from the woodwork, emboldened by the Bennett's bravery, eager to expose years of ignored complaints and systemic abuse. The airport's stock value plummeted. Airlines began quietly rerouting flights to neighboring hubs, unwilling to risk association with a scandal of this magnitude. Civil rights leaders called for nationwide audits of all major transportation hubs, arguing that if it could happen so openly at Hamilton, it could happen anywhere. Meanwhile, Olivia, Marcus, and Kayla kept a low profile, letting the institutions tear themselves apart under the weight of their own hypocrisy. Their work at the National Animal Rescue Initiative continued, stronger than ever, bolstered by an influx of donations and volunteers inspired by their stand for justice. But Olivia knew the war wasn't over. Not yet. The months following the scandal at Hamilton International Airport were filled with slow but undeniable change. Policies shifted, new leadership was installed, and oversight committees composed of civil rights experts and community advocates took root within the institution's previously impenetrable walls. Yet some transformations happened far from the public eye, in places where the cameras no longer followed, where redemption was not demanded but quietly, painfully pursued. Brandon Kessler's life had unraveled faster than he could comprehend. Once a man who swaggered through terminals with a clipboard and a smirk, he now found himself stacking boxes at a regional shipping warehouse, earning minimum wage under flickering fluorescent lights. The uniform he wore bore no badge, no authority, and every night he went home to a one-room apartment where the silence pressed down on him harder than the cheap mattress beneath his back. At first, he had railed against the injustice, painting himself as a victim of overzealous political correctness, a scapegoat sacrificed to appease an angry mob. But excuses wore thin when there was no audience left to hear them. Friends distanced themselves, families stopped returning calls, opportunities vanished like mist under a rising sun. Eventually, the walls of bitterness closed in so tightly that Brandon realized he had a choice. He could either stay imprisoned by his resentment, or he could confront the truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. It was that grim clarity that led him to a small, nondescript building on the edge of the city, where a nonprofit organization offered mandatory sensitivity training to individuals referred by court orders, employers, or, like Brandon, by sheer desperation. The first few sessions were torture. Brandon sat stiffly in a circle of folding chairs, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, sneering internally at the touchy-feely language and the forced smiles. But as the days wore on, something unexpected began to happen. He listened. He heard stories from people who had lived their entire lives, navigating obstacles he had never even considered. A young black woman recounted being followed around a grocery store every week as a child. A Middle Eastern man described the time he was dragged out of an airport security line and interrogated for hours based solely on his last name. A Latina nurse spoke through tears about being called a racial slur by a patient she was trying to save. And sitting there, stripped of his defenses, Brandon felt the first cracks in his armor. Shame bloomed inside him, hot and unrelenting. He remembered the look in Olivia Bennett's eyes, not of anger, but of exhaustion, of a pain so deep it transcended words. He thought of Kayla, her small body trembling beside her mother, trying to understand a world that dissolved. By the end of the course, Brandon didn't leave the building as a new man. Change didn't work that way. But he left with a burden heavier than his own self-pity. A burden he would carry forward, choosing to learn, to listen, to rebuild brick by painstaking brick the humanity he had once discarded so good. Elsewhere, Amelia Vaughn's journey took a different, more violent turn. After her termination, she returned to her hometown, hiding from the media storm that refused to die down. Her bitterness festered in the quiet spaces of her life, poisoning every interaction, every attempt at moving forward. It wasn't until the call came from her sister that the true magnitude of her blindness hit her. Her nephew, a bright-eyed biracial teenager named Connor, had been detained by local police while walking home from school. No charges, no apology, just suspicion, just fear. Amelia drove 4 hours. This wasn't supposed to happen to people she loved. Connor was a good kid. He didn't deserve this. Standing in the sterile lobby, watching her sister tremble with rage and helplessness, Amelia saw clearly for the first time the pain she had helped perpetuate. The look on her sister's face mirrored the look Olivia Bennett had worn that day at the airport, a look she had dismissed with a sneer and a careless word. The realization broke her. In the months that followed, Amelia changed course completely. She threw herself into advocacy work, volunteering for organizations that fought systemic injustice. She attended town halls, marched in protests, organized educational workshops on racial bias for small communities. She used her own story not to excuse herself but to illustrate how easily complicity could masquerade as professionalism, how good intentions meant nothing without action. Slowly, painfully, she rebuilt the fragments of her integrity. It wasn't redemption, and she didn't expect forgiveness from those she had wronged, but it was for a purpose. It was a start. Back in the city, the Bennetts continued their work at the National Animal Rescue Initiative, expanding their mission to include not just animal welfare but broader advocacy for equality and human dignity. Their faces graced magazine covers, their speeches inspired thousands, but they never forgot the lessons carved into their souls during those harrowing days. Olivia often thought of Brandon and Amelia not with hatred, but with a quiet hope that even the darkest paths could lead, eventually, toward the light. And as the city skyline shimmered in the distance and a new day dawned bright and full of promise, the story of the Bennetts and those they had forced to see the world anew stood not as a tale of revenge, but as a testament to the power of resilience, of Earl's and me, of the resilient spirit. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful journeys like this one, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring even more stories that matter to life. We would love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We always love seeing how far our community reaches. Stay tuned for more.